Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to today's, well, it's now a webinar, and happy to have you here. My name is Alex Fischera. I'm the owner of My Performance Coach, and was so grateful to be asked by the leadership at TEXO and those of the YCC originally to come speak with you all at the House of Blues for one of your monthly meetings. And due to circumstances and where we are right now, unfortunately, that isn't possible. However, when leadership looked at it and we began talking about how are we going to rebound from this, they really stepped on, the pedal, looking for ways that we could continue to deliver the best to its members and to really use this as an opportunity to stay with things that we can and to deliver some opportunities to learn and dive into what is really an area of significance when we talk about conflict and conflict management and using a constructive approach to it. Now, while our typical webinar that we've invited everybody to is going to have opportunities to engage with the webinar and answer some questions, this recording here is really about providing an opportunity for anybody who wasn't able to join us to still gather the information and siphon through it and see if there's any value in it that they could gain from it. So we'll take you through here for the next hour. We'll walk through a few things. But again, I want to thank you all that chose to continue staying with us, continue to work through all the challenges that you're currently going. I hope you, your families, communities, teams, colleagues, and businesses are all safe and are doing well and feeling well. And while it's times like this where there's a lot of uncertainty, that I really hope that we focus on the things that we do have control over, because there's so much out of our control. And one thing that's in your control is your ability to continue to develop yourself, to invest in yourself, and to educate yourself or train in the things that are going to really help you, whether they're right now or when you get back to sort of a cadence of your work. So you showing up and staying with us today and watching this and participating in this webinar is really an act of you taking control of your 50%. And so I'm very happy to have you here. I'm happy to be here. I'm very passionate about not only the construction industry, having been in it for nearly all my life, but as a former professional athlete, I know what it takes to play at the highest level. And I oftentimes see the private sector and businesses and teams very much like a sports team. And I look to bring a lot of what I've learned in that area to the current working sector and companies that you're with. So I hope you enjoy our content today. A couple of things about Zoom. If you're watching this but not participating, is that there's some functionality all over it. If for whatever reason this isn't playing well for you, or you're not picking up on any audio or not picking up on any of the video, please find some time to let us know, so I can go ahead and make sure that perhaps if there's something wrong with the file or get you a better copy, I can do that. After, you will receive an email, and if you wouldn't mind taking the survey that comes along with this video, it really helps us improve and really helps us take what's worked and sort of what additions can we add to it to really help that next group of people that could be working through the same sort of issues. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward for us to move and go forward. So let's get started. Okay, so today's sort of agenda is we're looking to move from sort of conflict to collaboration, and this sort of works on the spectrum where you have conflict on one side and collaboration on the other, but really they're tied together. And we want to at times move, and sometimes conflict can bring about collaboration, and likewise collaboration can bring a lot of conflict. But since the two are tied together, we really want to leverage the balance of the two of them. So for the next 50 minutes, we're going to start off, and we're going to start off with intro into conflict. This is where we're going to define the term, really get a basis for what it is, give some context to sort of this area that we're talking about, as well as looking at some of the numbers and some of the reasoning and see if we can get a little bit of buy-in, our mindset. We talk about leaning into it. A lot of times we're not ready to lean into it. And so we want to make sure that we've got some information that can help us really sort of shift that mindset. After that, we're going to go into the conflict management process. I really like having a process. When you've seen conflict a lot, and believe it or not, conflict is inevitable. It's going to be there. In fact, if you're watching this, you've been involved with or have seen or have taken part of some sort of conflict. So it's inevitable, especially in today. And if you've seen it over and over again, you understand that there's sort of a repeatable process when you've succeeded at conflict. And to repeat some action steps can really help you have a sort of anchor in what can typically be a tough time. We also want to use the process to help us anticipate and sort of detect conflict. How can we stay ahead of it? And how can we see it before it's happening? That way we're really proactive versus reactive. After that, we're going to move more into a sort of response phase, is where we sort of look at what are the typical responses to conflict, how can we leverage one against the other, what's the right scenario or situation to use one tool versus another. We want to look at some practical ways to lean into conflict. What are some questions we can ask that helps us shift? What are some ways that we can really take, again, control over the things we do have? And we're going to look at some of the scientific sort of aspects that help us create a early warning detection system and help us process through conflict a little bit easier. Then we're going to go on to managing through collaboration. This is where we really kind of complete the whole cycle. And I want to give you, again, another practical framework for how you can manage conflict through collaboration, how you can institute a certain framework that will allow you to address conflict either individually or as a team and really grab a hold of it and make something out for yourself. So let's start with intro to conflict, and let's really kind of look at, a different way of looking at conflict or conflict management. And I put up here project management equals conflict management. Now, this is important because I know everybody comes from a different role, but essentially all of us, if you're leading a team or you're on top of a project, you're leading a project of some sort, and you have to manage that project. But project management is really about getting to the end result. Typically, if you have managed the project well, then you have the results you're looking for, those expectations that have been put on you by anyone within the company. But we don't want to be focused. It's important to know the results and be focused. That's what we would call the lagging indicator. What are the results? But we really want to also bring in the leading indicators, the things that add up to the final results, the things that make the biggest difference, and the things we can look at to repeat again when we're looking to have the same sort of success rate. And so when we look at a successful management of a project, what goes into that? And that's why we got here, that if you are successful in managing conflict, chances are you'll be successful at managing a project. And so I often tell people, I ask them, what are you paid to do? Well, I'm paid to deliver results on time within budget. I said, okay, but what are you paid to do? Really what you're paid to do is to be able to hold and handle tough situations, have difficult conversations, but leverage them and come out of them with real positive effects and sort of a momentum. And that's what you're ended up being paid to do. That's the bulk of it. Over 80% of our time is dealt in with conversations. And so conflict and how we operate in that conversation is going to be paramount to sort of pulling off our overall task and generating the results. But let's look at a couple of other areas. Let's look at the true impact of conflict. And the real price of conflict goes far beyond the current project you're on. In fact, it has a cascading effect into multiple projects. And that's both a good and a sort of challenging area. That good in the sense of, if you do it right, can have a real compounding effect and will create a lot of trust and sort of really build upon down the road. However, if you're misusing certain techniques, or you're not really getting the resolve that you want in a certain conflict, you can actually end up doing more damage. And so that's why it's ever so important to be working and focused on how you can improve your conflict management or your response to conflict in any sort of given time. I also want to look at today's environment. When we look at today's projects, they're influenced more than ever by conflict. And what I mean is that companies and customers want things done faster and cheaper. You have differing strategic initiatives and higher expectations placed on quality. Your job sites look drastically different with the different numbering of vendors and different points of views and policies. And so we really have to look at conflict in the sense of it's going to be there. It's going to be everywhere we go. It's sometimes happening right underneath our noses. And to not invest and not spend time sharpening this sort of side of our abilities would be a big disservice to even honoring the position in the industry that we're in. I want to look at it from the standpoint of optimal performance. I mean, I'm always looking to get the most out of any situation. I'm looking for what's the optimal performance. And we've been dealing in the construction industry with a lack of productivity increasing. And it's been that way for probably 10 years or so. And we've never really seen the needle move one way or the other. Well, this is a great way that we can get that needle to move. And really the optimal performance of conflict management is about reducing negative effects. We're talking about taking layers away, not adding things onto it. Conflict is going to happen. What can we do to not add any additional layers onto that conflict so that we can really limit the amount of effect it's going to have on productivity and performance? And you can often see it sometimes in the performance. You look at morale, you look at cooperation. These are some of the obvious sort of indicators of whether or not you're handling conflict well and whether performance is something that's likely. Some of the less obvious ones are the deterioration of trust. It's hard to quantify that. It's hard to see it until it's right there and you notice it. And so we're going to discuss this a little bit more, but being well equipped in the conflict management arena is really going to help you reach optimal performance. Lastly, I want to look at sort of the fact that the numbers don't lie. The numbers don't lie. It's always good to have, equally some quantitative analysis to go along with the qualitative. So some numbers to support sort of the theories and the concepts. And I know there's plenty of you out there that numbers mean quite a bit, facts, and we can share some of those right now. Let's take a look at a couple of data points. And these data points were gathered from a multitude of research and different studies. I wanted to make sure that I found consistent numbers that made sense, numbers that are relevant and up to date. And so I've just got a few points here that I want to talk about in sort of general sense. And then you make this sort of determination of if this is something you can relate to. We start off with 161 hours. Now, this 161 hours was a data point that related to the amount of time reported spent managing conflict. And it ranged anywhere from low 25 minutes up to weeks and perhaps months. So the average was about 161 hours when they looked at, I believe it was the 40 plus different types of conflicts that were being managed throughout the industry. And 161 hours is a lot of time for someone to be involved and spending on managing conflict. If we can reduce that number of time, well, we know what more time will give us. And so I don't have to harp on that much more. 11,000. Okay, well, maybe 11,000 because you got big projects doesn't seem like a real significant number at this point. But this was the number observed cost per incident when we looked at those same sort of 40 plus conflicts that were being managed. 11,000 on average, that's anywhere from a few dollars up to a couple $100,000. So the average against all these was around $11,000. Now I'll remind you that the 11,000 is only on observed cost. And that's really, and think about how much conflict you have. Maybe it's a couple times a week, maybe how many, if you added them up, then sort of multiply that by 11 and you've got a significant cost associated with your conflict management. And again, this is not taking into account the unobserved costs, things like what the lack of trust might do or something along that lines. 50% more payout in healthcare costs. That means people that are needing to go get some assistance, or they need something to help them relieve stress, or medication that maybe comes with high blood pressure, and so your overall healthcare costs are going to increase. Now, that 50% number also relates to the voluntary departure. So when we talk turnover and retention, especially in our industry where labor is already strapped, we cannot afford to lose people for any wrong reasons. 50% of voluntary departures, that means people who take it upon themselves to want to leave, are leaving because of some sort of conflict or poor conflict management. 28% relates to loss of work time if they're the target of conflict. So usually there's two people involved in conflict. So that's 28 times 2, because we're both losing work time if we're the target of conflict. Either we take a day off, so absenteeism, or loss of time because we're just sort of really stuck in that moment, or we're actually dealing with the problem itself and not working on the things that are moving the project forward. And lastly, 53%. This is the lost time worrying about the incident. Poorly managed conflict, or just conflict in general, really weighs on the sort of psyche and the mental side of everyday work. And with all the things we have currently ongoing, it's like one more conflict is just going to like cripple things. And 53% is sort of the average loss of time worrying about the incident. So these numbers, when you kind of look at them and see if they sort of relate to the things that you're seeing, I think you begin to realize, okay, it's more than just sort of a concept of, okay, we need to get better at conflict management. This is one small way that we can make significant gains on project productivity, engagement from others, and really end up making a profit in a lot of ways. Let's switch over and let's go ahead and see if we can't define what is conflict. Now, a simple definition of what conflict is conflict is any situation where your concerns or desires differ from another person. Yours differs from another person. I like it. It's simple. Everybody kind of gets it. However, this definition doesn't really speak to the depth of what conflict is experienced. It doesn't speak to the heightened level of hostility that can come with certain types of conflict. Sometimes conflict is accumulated. Sometimes it just sprung up. Sometimes it's over big things. Sometimes it's over small things. And we can see that in some of the terms that we interchange and use with conflict. Terms like risk, or dispute, or issue, or even opportunity. We see that there's some depth in sort of how we view it, and sort of the term we ascribe to the certain conflict gives us a sort of evolved form of conflict in itself. And so while we do have a simple definition that sort of oversimplifies and puts two different people together with differing views, there is some definite depth to it, and different ways we can see it or speak about it or communicate about it using different terms. Let's look at a quick breakdown. A quick breakdown of what I want to focus on is really the two types of conflict, the sort of two types of conflict, because it is going to be in everything, quite common, guaranteed, but there are really two types. Now, our first type, boo, is going to be harmful conflict. This is when it is unmanaged. Now, we're talking about conflict management. And that's assuming that we know that it's good to manage conflict. But harmful conflict is one when it's unmanaged. And you can tell unmanaged conflict by a couple of things. You can tell if it damages relationships. You can tell if performance suffers, or if the environment becomes toxic, or future projects begin to suffer. These are signs of harmful conflict. Not conflict that we really want to have on our projects, and when it becomes really harmful. But the other side of it is where we're really looking to get to. This is the leaning inside of it. This is the boom, what we want, beneficial conflict. This is when it is managed. This is what happens when you take a topic like this seriously. You investigate a little bit more, you try on a few things, and you continue to be vigilant about getting better at conflict and conflict management, conflict resolution type scenarios. You'll know when you're having beneficial Conflict when people are reaching their full potential. You've got improved creativity and problem solving. Guys on the site are actually taking something that happened and creating something good out of it, or taking steps ahead of it to go ahead and make sure it doesn't happen again. You've got improved relations. Teams are coming together. Guys are communicating. People are being able to have good discourse. And one of the main things you see is that there's a reduction in becoming sort of static. This is the beneficial of why we need conflict, because without conflict, we become sort of unresponsive to the pressures for necessary change. Too much harmony can really shut down in a group and just begin to accept the status quo. And I want to use sort of what we're experiencing today with the COVID-19. What we're experiencing today is sort of an opportunity for us. There is a conflict. There is a differencing, whether it's between two people or maybe just sort of two states of natural. There's this normalcy and now this new normal. There's this conflict, this differencing of sort of the way things are. And if we choose to look at it, not so much as the, oh, woe is me, but what can we learn from this opportunity? How can I use this sort of change to catapult a lot of the necessary things that need to take over? And so I don't become static in the way I view my healthcare. I don't become static in the way that I view everyday life. The change can now be good to help us sort of step back and see what sort of things do need to change. So positive outcomes can come from beneficial conflict. So we talked about conflict. Let's add management to it. I've thrown the word out there a couple times. Let's talk about what is conflict management. Now, the traditional view of conflict management really focuses on solving the immediate issue. What's in front of me right here, and let me solve this thing. But I want to caution and guard you that oftentimes what you're seeing here now, right in front of you, the conflict that you're dealing with, the immediate issue, is sometimes just symptomatic of a much larger issue, and there's more causation to what's going on, and maybe right now it's just a convenient way or time to be dealing with something that's deeper, and it comes to you right now. And so we really want to drill down through a lot of the things that come to us here now, and we'll talk about some practical ways that you can go ahead and you can do that. But what conflict management is, it's when it's redirected from hostility to beneficial problem solving. We move it from harmful to beneficial. That's when you're dealing with something, you're managing conflict, is because you're making it better and you're using it as leverage. What it is not is that it's not conflict that's being suppressed, acting like it's not happening, or just acting as though it's going to go away, or that what you're seeing in front of you is just sort of, oh, I fixed it right now, it won't rear its head again. So that's not conflict management. Conflict management is really taking a very sort of broad approach to it and just not being comfortable with our assumptions that what we're dealing with right in front of us is all that's there. But I can tell you that your ability to manage conflict is going to depend on three sort of key areas. It's going to depend on your skill. And I love talking about the ability of skill in conflict management, because that skill is something you can get better at. As a former professional athlete, we could get better at skill. Okay, you can practice, you can do drills, you can try on different approaches, and you can see how it goes, and you can navigate. And the more repetition and more experience you have, the better you end up getting. And so it's kind of like a win-learn mentality, but your skill is going to be it. So have some patience. Sometimes, this goes in sort of to the next point of the situation. Some of us haven't interacted with conflict a whole lot, or maybe it's specific types of conflict. And we really sort of have to have some patience and not really harp on ourselves or get down on ourselves a whole lot in times of conflict, because it might be the first time we're dealing with it. And if we use that win-learn mentality, we know that, okay, if I look at this thing as an opportunity to learn, I can then use it again and get better and better and better. So the situation, again, it could be a very severe one versus a not so severe conflict. And so the situation is going to leverage what skills you might have or what you need in that appropriate moment. And then the final one is going to be your preferences, your sort of natural behaviors, and sort of your preference for dealing with conflict, or how you typically do it, or even somebody else's, taking into account their natural preferences for dealing with conflict. And our next slide, I kind of want to just, it might be busy to the eyes, but let yourself just sort of soak it in for a second. Let me walk you through a few things, and show you how your natural preferences, the behavior style. What we have here on the left is what I use with a lot of individuals, but teams I work with, in looking at the behavior styles. Now, the image on the left is taking individual disc behaviors and plotting them out on a wheel to sort of assess where the team is at from a much larger scope. The image on your right sort of breaks down the colors and the areas of disc, and shows that there is just natural, there's just natural conflict that can already be predetermined and predicted for what you're going to see. And so take a look at the image on the left. If you were to draw a line across the middle, you would see that the majority of people fall up onto the upper half of it. Now, if you take that over to the image to the right, what you would say is that, if our team ends up having potentially a conflict, I first want to see, is it just a natural conflict that we can kind of get right to the heart of it right off the start? That top half of that wheel, and if you look to the image to the right, it's really about a sort of priority conflict. The high C and the high D dimension, or top behavior styles, they're really going to put their priorities on being direct, on accomplishing the goals and the tasks. Whereas the bottom half is really about relationships, is really about people, and again, a natural conflict. So when I look at these wheels, it's not to say, oh, well, we got to get different people in here. It's about recognizing where you are, that there are natural conflicts that can come up, and how you can, again, anticipate and sort of say, well, let me look at this first. And if I know we're heavy on the side of very task oriented, I might during conflict want to check back in with the people side of it, and see what we can do to offset it a little bit. And so it's always good to look into natural preferences, and not assume that every conflict you're getting into has these sort of deep-seated issues, or malicious intent, or that it's much bigger at times than it really needs to be. And so knowing sort of your preferences, the preferences of your team or those you're working with, can be really critical in helping you alleviate any sort of excessive layers to conflict. So hopefully that sort of gave some context to conflict, and we're looking at now, more into the process of it. We get it, we've seen the numbers, we understand what conflict is, harmful, beneficial, and some of the easy things to look at. But now it's about, let's start looking at a process. Let's start looking at some practical ways that we can get better, and sort of apply some sort of conflict management to our own sort of the personal or professional lives. So I want to take you through the conflict management process. And this is really about understanding certain variables that rarely change. And I definitely, again, challenge you to see if you've seen these variables play out in any conflicts that you're involved with. And when we understand the process, it becomes very much like a blueprint. You can look at it, you go step by step, and the more you do it, we talk about skill, the more you do it, the more easily you're able to recall it. And so at times it can appear, wow, this is a lot of work. But I can tell you that, if anything was worth it, it doesn't always come easy. You're going to have to do it a few times to get really good at it. And as you do it more and more, and you stick to the process, you'll actually find that you naturally will be able to recall what you need to do, and just start going through it and living it out. So yeah, initially you might have to put some time into it and go back to the blueprint. But after you've really built that sort of process in, you'll be able to recall it quite quickly. And so this process will help you create some space, think clearly, and again, we'll touch on some other areas on why creating space is essential. Our first step is to prepare for conflict. The reason why it's the first step is because you can't really get to the others effectively without starting here. Prepare for conflict. What do I mean by preparing for conflict? Well, who's involved? Who are the key players? Who are they? What do I know about them? Is there natural conflict based on what I know about them? We just spoke about that with the disc behavior. I also want to know about the motivation and importance of this sort of conflict or the other side of it. What do I think the other person's view is right now? I have to step outside of mine and take some time to just think through it. I'm going to give you some practical questions called the golden questions here in just a little bit. The golden questions will help you understand motivation and importance so that you don't get caught sort of in your own sort of lenses and only seeing conflict through the way you're dealing with it. Remember, there's more than one person typically involved in a conflict. And I also want to say that you got to be thorough when you're in your preparation. Remember, drive down to a couple of different levels, go past the sort of first issue that you're seeing and seeing if exploring, in fact, if there are any sort of other effects or other issues that you have to sort of look at too. There could be multiple issues rolled up into one sort of conflict. But as soon as we're done preparing, now it's sort of like, okay, let's mitigate some of the sort of hostilities that we can see coming down the road here. Conflict is inevitable, and we want to be proactive with it. And so if you've ever been in a conflict with somebody, think about, have you ever wanted to settle it now and they're not ready to settle it? um, and you try and say, oh, well, I want to handle this right now. But they're not ready to. And so mitigating hostilities is about agreeing on a time and place to resolve. You really want to say, perhaps, hey, I noticed, and this is really a conflict and it doesn't sit well with me, but I do want to address it. When would be a good time to address it? What are you thinking about? That really sort of takes the level down. You're mitigating it because you're communicating that it's important to you, but you're also being respectful about how to approach it with somebody who may not be ready at that time. They may need time to process it or even time to just gather their emotions. And we really want to bring that level of trust again together before getting through it. And so, again, not trying to add layers. We want to lean in. And so if we can mitigate, we can truncate a lot of things that can come with the conflict as it will come out. We'll talk a little bit more about the big 5 ways to handle conflict, the different methods you could use to really resolve any sort of conflict. But I stress to you that it's not one-sided, that one method you choose and somebody chooses a different method, those things can collide. You really have to get agreement in saying, well, are we going to, is compromise the right way to handle this conflict? Is it to avoid it where we both go our own ways and never talk about it again? But you do need agreement on those sorts of things. And so method selection is again, finding the right one, but also, discussing and finding which one is going to be productive for both sides of it. It's kind of, again, the 50% rule. You can only really, and this what makes conflict sort of difficult at times, is that you can really only control your side of it, and you're hoping that when you show that calmness and you show that steadiness, that it spills out into the other side, and they too end up looking after their own 50%. So the last part is about really, the second to last part is about following through. This is that planning and prep just aren't enough. You have to follow through in order to succeed and see it all the way. Both parties need to be motivated and share responsibility for it. That sometimes is tough to take because things can get very heated. Again, why we might want to mitigate a lot of hostilities prior to finding a method and then go ahead and going through it. But following through is also about actions, monitoring, evaluating actions, really for the sense of that's what the process needs to be successful. I need to monitor if what we said and is really happening, and evaluating, was it the right method? Was it the right selection? Is this working out? Are we moving forward? So you want to evaluate it, which then goes right into response. The life cycle of a conflict can oftentimes extend pretty long. And, sometimes it doesn't work out perfect. You need to be able to call it out when a certain method hasn't been productive and respond right there, right now, so that you don't add another layer and perhaps the conflict you were trying to really manage ends up being the catalyst for a much larger conflict down the road. And so we want to make sure that we're responding and perhaps go back through your process system at that point if you're finding that the method you chose being evaluated is not really working. And here we go. Our last step is be flexible. Conflict is complex. It's got long-term effects. It doesn't really give you a tremendous amount of control. And you've got to be patient, especially if this is sort of something new to you or you don't typically do well in conflict. Have some patience with yourself. It's okay. A lot of us have been there before. And again, conflict evolves. And if you are flexible and evolving sometimes and being aware of when it is evolving, you can be more agile and you can really, again, respond proactively versus reacting to it. But I want to help you sort of look at how you can anticipate and detect conflict so that, again, be more proactive, less reactive. And the first is that, again, we just kind of went back over, and these points are just to sort of bring it all together, is that conflict is not a single point. It's accumulated. And sometimes it accumulates because of miscommunication or we miss the opportunity to call it out quickly. And so we can't really see it as these single points in time, and that sometimes there are depths to it, which means that if you're seeing it, damage may have been done already. And check in with that. Look at those deeper levels. Make sure that what you're seeing right now isn't something that just popped up. If there are deeper levels, you want to be able to go down to those levels and solve those conflicts. And then the ones that you're seeing today just sort of fizzle out. Now, a lot of that means that, communication is key, and we'll talk about that as a skill, but plan early. Talk about it with others. Have that talk right up front in the planning stage, so you don't get in this blame game. Talk about it with others. Hey, we're going to come into conflict here at some point during this project. Does everybody know kind of appropriate ways to handle it, who to go to, the sort of tempo you want to set, perhaps as the leader or the person that's sort of running that group, letting people know this is how I would prefer to handle these things. And if you set that tone from the start, again, you are anticipating that conflict is going to be happening and you're sort of getting to it first. This next one, looking sideways, it refers to sort of a term we used back in professional sports was, keep your head on a swivel, looking all around you here like this. And so that you have to get involved in the work because it's easy to lose focus. If we're working, sometimes we've got blinders on and we miss some of the most obvious things, cues or signals. So, but if we're keeping our head on a swivel, we're sort of like looking for it, things like looking at an estimate. Are there differences? So what are those about? Are people enthusiastic about their work? Is there a reluctancy to commit to a certain responsibility? These things kind of help you look for those triggers and things that can really sort of take hold and snowball on you if you're not able to see them. MBWA, this is how you stay in touch with the energy and the people on the ground. Management by wandering around. Now, that's not easy for everybody to just kind of wander around, so you get a circuit rider. This is somebody else that is key. You probably know who they are. They're very friendly. They've got a lot of trust with many people, and they're able to give you the feedback. And you're able to say, "What are you seeing down there? What's the sort of pulse of what's going on the project? Is there anything you think that can boil up to a conflict?" Bring that person in and have them once in a while take a little stroll around, and again, stay on the ground with your people and really get a sense of what's going on. The last point I want to talk about in sort of the anticipation are these sort of key commitment points, and these sort of happen throughout the life cycle of a project, whether it's in the conceptual phase or the planning phase or the implementation or the closeout. Major points can cause conflicts. And these commitment points are commitment points such as, budgets are commitment points that usually typically come right after the conceptual side of it, before the planning side of it, or deadlines that come right after the planning, resources or quality control that comes with closeout. Typically, these large points, these commitment points, are going to bring some level of conflict. And if you know that ahead of time, you're more well equipped to not be so caught off guard when the time comes and when it's happening. So look at those commitment points as a point in time to say, yeah, I knew that was going to come, but I'm prepared now to be dealing with it. So we're going to continue here and sort of, now that we've looked at a process, we looked at a bit of anticipation and how to detect it. Now we're going to be on the side of response. What are some conflict management responses? What are the different styles? What's going to matter the most? And what I usually say is, I'll go to the next slide here, but because this is the recording and not the live webinar, this was a point where we were actually going to do an activity together, but I'll talk you through it a little bit. You just won't get the benefit of looking at the poll numbers that go with it. But what we see here is how you respond in times of conflict reveals a lot. Just like Coach Wooden when it says that, sports reveals character. Well, there are some key moments in every sort of leader or manager's workflow that those points in time are when you can either accelerate and build tremendous amount of trust and communication and cooperation. But in the same time, if you're not effective in those, you can deteriorate it and actually do a lot more damage. So it's not about being there all day, every day. It's about being there in those highly critical moments, in those key conversations, owning those, getting better at those. And so how you respond, both when things are calm and there's conflict, or when there's conflict happening, what we would call in the storm, what you do in that moment can really, again, be a binding and a sort of a growth for you and your team and your projects, or again, it can deteriorate things rather quickly. And I want you to know that there are several different tools. I mean, how you respond reveals, again, more about you, more about the value of somebody else. And you have several tools. So if you stepped on a job, not every job and every task you're working on requires, a hammer or this tool or that tool. So you've got some tools. It's about discernment. It's about understanding which tool is going to ultimately provide you with the best outcome. And I want to go through a few of those. So the 5 tools that we're going to talk about really date back to the 70s. They're still used today. Each one involves a level of assertiveness, sort of satisfying your desire, versus the cooperativeness. That's the satisfying of another person's desire. So the first one we've got is competing. This is a win-lose scenario. It's sort of a tool you would use when you have to act quick. It also needs to be understood that it can also undermine trust. If you act too quickly and you just go ahead and pick it up and do it because you don't have the time to teach somebody or coach them through it, then they don't believe you trust them enough to do it. And so you want to be very careful when you pull out the competing time. But sometimes you got to act quick. That's when you got to pull it in. The next one is the accommodating sort of method. And this is lose-win. When you're accommodating, somebody is not getting what they want. Somebody is getting what they want. And it is a bit about being reasonable. Sometimes you want to be reasonable, and that's why you accommodate. And oftentimes it's a conflict that's not really of high importance. It's low importance, so it's like, I can accommodate on this. It's not the biggest thing I'm dealing with. But also, again, be careful, because it can be interpreted as sort of retreating. If somebody looks at it and says, well, you overly accommodated this person, like you pulled away from it. So you just want to make sure, again, when you're using this, who's supervising, this conflict, or looking at it, and make sure that, again, it's appropriate for the situation that you're in. Our next one is the sort of avoiding method. We don't know who's winning and who's losing because nobody showed up. But I can tell you that oftentimes avoiding And we're not talking that you have to avoid for long periods of time, but stepping away and avoiding a conflict, if it isn't the right place and time to be having the conflict, avoiding the conflict can ease tensions and buy you some time to really collect your thoughts and really find a way of proceeding and going forward. Um, Again, there's a downside perhaps to it where it can have its own perceptions, and this perception being one of arrogance or fear. If you avoid it, it's sort of, I'm too good to deal with this conflict, or I don't want to go deal with that because I'm afraid of what will come out of it. And so again, we want to look at these sides of it before we really choose to use that method. Compromising, again, is a bit of a lose-lose. If you've compromised, then you're both not really getting what you want out of it. And so as we're compromising, it is giving you a level of importance. You are saying it's important enough to me that I would rather compromise than not get anything out of it. One thing that, when you're bringing in compromising, power balance can be a disruptor to compromising. If somebody's if the balance of power is way out, it's not really going to be a compromise. Somebody's probably going to get something else out of it, and it's going to probably go towards one of the. Again, you both aren't using the same sort of method at that point. They might then say, "Well, it's competing for me because I've got the power here." So, make sure you're using compromising in a very skillful sort of way. But it also is temporary. When you compromise, it's happening here and now, and so it's not a long-term deal, and it oftentimes takes less time to compromise. So there are some value points there to using it. The last one, and probably our most important, all of the styles emphasize a give and take problem solving, based on distribution of power or past experience, but they don't directly affect trust. There is only one response that really forges stronger relationships. It's forward looking, it commits to future payoffs, and it's how you build trust. And that's the collaborating method. Collaborating really puts a high importance on the conflict you're dealing with. It's about it brings people together, it builds and strengthens those relationships, and again, it's sort of, you're investing in it. So it might take a little bit more time to resolve, but the payout is going to be more substantial when you're using that sort of method. So the last thing I want to just touch back on is we talked on skills. We talked on why skills are important. And again, the inappropriate use of any of these can really result in increased conflict. And so you want to get agreement with those on what style you're going to use. I think the number is about 80% of people misunderstood what agreement was reached to. So if you're really not agreeing after you come out of some sort of conflict resolution on what's been agreed to, the chances are there was a misunderstanding about, is that what we were doing here and what my role was? But you can see here with the different modes, different skills can be leveraged and used. If you're going to compromise, having the skill of negotiation and an attitude of sort of fairness is going to play off well. I like the avoid mode and hiding. If you're going to use the method of avoiding, you want to be good at hiding. Maybe not, if you're avoiding conflict, maybe not, eating lunch where everybody's doing, maybe bring your lunch if you want to avoid it. And that could be a skill in hiding. So there are different skills you can leverage to be much better and to help you choose a method going forward. But let me give you some practical ways that you can start to change. Again, conflict gives us the opportunity to communicate value and safety to somebody else. That when you respond in times of conflict, you are telling somebody else how you value them. So choosing the right method is really about choosing how I want to let this person know what I think of them. And that's why it's very critical at any moment to make sure that you're choosing the right method, because you can either do a lot of repair, or again, you can really eclipse over a lot of good work and do some detriment to things that have been built. And so, how do you communicate in a time of conflict that's going to consciously sort of communicate value and safety? We look at sort of the golden questions. I spoke about these earlier. These are from a mediator. And again, this can be either used for you personally to look at and ask yourself these questions as you're sort of reflecting and analyzing a conflict, or if you're sort of the mediator between two individuals that are in conflict, use these questions. And these questions are just as follows. What what is your main concern, or what is your main, getting somebody to think about what is your main concern here. What is it really that gets you going about what's taking place here? What's your main concern? Well, my main concern is that if we don't address this issue now, that we're going to have to do twice the amount of work down the road. Okay, so you're laying out the concern side of it. What do you want to happen? What's the end game? What would you like to see happen from resolving this conflict? Or what would you like to see happen when we get this all done? And the last question is, what do you want the other person to understand? When we frame it this sort of way, we go into our next sort of bit of being able to separate the people from the problem. You are focused now on the problem, not the people. And you don't want to confuse the issue at hand with the person that you're dealing with, okay? You don't want to confuse the two of them. And so in the classic negotiation book, the first tip is to do just that. Don't confuse the person with the issue. Separate the two as much as you can. And those questions can really help you separate that and focus, focus on interests, not positions. You want to focus on interests and not positions, and getting to the bottom of what each person really wants or needs, okay? And let's talk about focusing on interest. I want to share with you a clip called The Orange Coral and see if you can pick up on why this is significant to the overall growth of conflict management.
I'd like to retell a familiar tale called The Orange Quarrel to illustrate what we mean by beyond win-win. This story is adapted from Getting to Yes by Fisher and Urey at Harvard University. It was a rather explosive situation because two children were using adversarial methods that ignored the interests of the other party. Both children wanted the only orange, and they were heading for a lose-lose situation, destroyed orange, or at best, win-lose if one child overpowered the other for the whole orange. Fortunately, a clever mediator came along with a good idea. Jenny cut, Joey choose. This was a good solution and a win-win solution compared to what could have happened in an all-out fight. All things being equal, this seemed like a pretty fair solution. Both children got 50% of what they wanted. But it turns out that we can do even better than this when we recognize that there are two important objectives that help us achieve superior agreements: fairness and efficiency. Divide the benefits fairly and don't leave value on the table. The children in this conflict were using adversarial methods, assuming a one-dimensional model of negotiations. Both children wanted the whole orange, and the problem was that if one was to get more, the other had to get less. The first step in solving this problem is to relabel these scales. Instead of thinking that each child wants 100% of the orange, consider rather that each child wants to become 100% satisfied. Now we can take these scales and reorient them so that we're viewing the case in multidimensional satisfaction space. Now it's no longer necessarily true that one party has to lose when another one gains. Recall the solution in our previous scenario. We did achieve our fairness objective. Both parties got 50% of what they wanted, but when we plot this solution on the graph, we see that there may be room for improvement. To further explore this, we dig a little deeper into our bag of interest-based principles and ask each child why they want the orange. It turns out that Jenny isn't interested in eating the orange. She wants to bake a cake that calls for the peels of exactly one orange. Joey, on the other hand, can never get enough oranges to eat, but always throws the peels into the waste bin. So now you know the optimal solution. Give Jenny all the peels and Joey all the fruit. They both get 100% of what they wanted, which achieves our efficiency objective.
So mutual gain, again, looking for or inventing options that help you get the most out of it, the most optimal way of getting something out of it. I lastly want to talk on sort of the final key that can really help you out. And this is sort of understanding what is going on neurologically when we encounter conflict and it induces even the most moderate amount of stress. What you can see here on the graph on the left, and I remember I went up to Yale and had done a study looking at brain waves and looking at how we can offset a lot of these triggers and stressors to get sort of our brain waves back on track. The typical thing is that we get an impulse through our sensory thalamus, and then it gets hijacked over to the amygdala, basically input, output, conflict in, response out. And what essentially has happened is that we've been hijacked, and we've been hijacked in sort of the worst way because we've hijacked routing our sort of senses into the most important part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex. That sensory cortex is responsible for, look at all these sort of things it's responsible for: dealing with change, processing stimuli, attention control, self-awareness, memory. If we don't understand that, if we can't recognize when we are in conflict and we are stressed and have a sort of way of getting out of it, then we're sort of closing ourselves off to being able to really deal with it, choose the right method, and really use constructively what we have towards beneficial conflict. And so, I challenge you to say, do you know what your defensive look is? Do you know how you act or operate, or when you can tell? The body is very specific, and you can oftentimes tell when you are getting defensive because it'll let you know that. Stress will let you know perhaps that you are getting a bit defensive. And so I want to take a look at your early warning system. Now, I'll give you a step. The first one is you have to acknowledge it, and if only to yourself. Use the body when you become stressed. Do your palms get sweaty? Do you get an itch somewhere? Do you fold your arms? Do you get tense? What happens when you get a moderate amount of stress or you feel like conflict is coming? The next part of it is you have to slow down. You have to reroute that sort of sensory impulse. And what we know about the body is that it's a very smart system, to the point of where your body will send off, again, those feelings of when it is stressed. We actually have a system internally that can help send a message back to our brain to tell it to calm down, and that's through breath. Certain breathing techniques can really allow you to send the message back when you feel stressed. I oftentimes work with people and I give them the 4-7-8 method of breathing, where you breathe in on the 4 count, you hold for 7, and then you release the breath on the final 8 count. Now that's all of, I don't know, what is it, roughly 20 seconds worth of your time. And if you do it, 3 or 4 times, you're only about a minute. But again, it's a way for you to send a message back to your brain saying, I understand I'm stressed, but I sort of need this thing up here right now, and I would appreciate it if you kind of gave it back to me. And so using it a way of slowing down will help you kind of counteract that out of controlness that we might have going into conflict. The third step is check your self-talk. What story are you giving yourself right now? What are you telling yourself in this moment that's making you want to be defensive? And don't skip past this step too quickly. Sit there and reflect again. Buy yourself some time. Give yourself some space to really think through and look through it. And then, of course, your last one is then now you're ready to proceed on with an action step. So lastly, I just want to bring you through what we call issue processing, but it doesn't always have to be about an issue. It can be about a decision that you have to make, or it can be about a challenge that you're trying to overcome. And this is how you can bring other people together and collaborate to manage any sort of conflict. A problem share is a problem halved or more. And so we really want to use multiple points of power, experience to flush out root causes, and to come out with some real high impact skillful decisions that can help accelerate the process and get to where we need to go. Sometimes we're so invested in something, the most obvious choices are the ones we can't really see. And so processing through it with others can oftentimes give us the best result. And again, using collaboration is going to not only work on several different skills, as you can see from the benefit, but it's going to build trust more amongst your team and team members. And so let's walk through and look at some of the processing phases along with the decision flow chart. So first is on the individual. Either you can take yourself through this or really through this group, and an individual would say, how you'd ask these specific points. How do I overcome deadlines? How do I overcome meeting this deadline? Or how do I overcome this issue I might be having with the GC? And you want to frame it with a little bit more context. So the individual would also say, it's important to me because the relationship with this GC is paramount to getting the project across the deadline. What have I done to this date? Well, to this date, I've gone on several lunches. I've reached out to them. I've made an effort in this way or that way. So you're telling somebody what you have done. Now you really have to follow this flow chart. A lot of times when people, and I've done this the wrong way, that's how I know. Someone will come to you and they'll ask you a question, and you turn around, you give them an answer, and they're like, well, they kind of look at you sideways. I didn't take the time to ask them, what have you done already, before telling them what I think. Now, I tell them what I think. If they had already done it, then they're thinking, oh, what did I come to this person for if they're just going to tell me something I had already done? They didn't even take the time to ask me what I've done. So we want to follow along this process as best as we can. And then you want to really state, what do you want from the group? Do you want the group to give you solutions? You want the group to confirm a certain direction that you're going? Do you want them to just listen to you? You really want to let them know the expectations of what you want to come out of this. Now, the next part then is less on the individual, and more about the group. Now it's time for the group to ask what we call clarifying questions. These are questions that drill down to causation. We don't really know if the issue or challenge presented is the one we should be dealing with. So we want to investigate. Let me ask you some questions. Let me see if I can drill down. There might be something more going on here, and that is what we should be talking about, not this. And so we ask clarifying questions, and we sort of have a little bit of dialogue. No solutions. It's very hard to hold up on this process. Most people want to go right to, here's what I've done, or why didn't you do this? Again, we want to clarify questions, get more understanding about what this person is dealing with, and sort of really get a grasp on it. Now, if it finds out that there's a little bit more there, well, then we want to go ahead and reissue a sort of statement. If there's a different issue we're dealing with, let's go back up and issue that as the how do I statement versus the one that was presented the first time. And then the individual would say yes or no. It's okay that it's not, you might be dealing with the right issue. So it's okay to go down that route. Now we're on back to the group to say, okay, what are your suggestions? What experiences have you had? What sort of creative ways can you think about helping me resolve this? And this is time for the group to go ahead and share those things. And the individual is sitting back and letting it come. What you should say is, that's interesting, that's interesting. Not sort of putting it down or saying it's not possible. Allow the group to share with you, because next is where you're going to come back in and you're going to pick a suggestion, or perhaps say, yes, I haven't done that. That's what I'm going to do. And the group wants to hold you to it. They want to create accountability for you, and pick something that you can do again, or maybe something else came up when you're talking through it. Oftentimes when you ask people clarifying questions, they sort of figure it out sometimes on their own. But you want to definitely go ahead and choose something and say, yes, I'm going to do this by this date, and I will let you all know how it's going. Follow that loop back and make sure that the group knows that you've tried it on. What was sort of the end game? What happened? What was the result? Share that with your group. Okay. So here again is another great process and a flow chart. I know we went through it a little bit quick, but again, you have this video. You can go back through it. And you see this in a lot of different forms out there. This is just one way of seeing the flow chart, how it goes through. But again, this is a very, very skillful way of collaborating and solving very key, high impact issues, challenges, decisions that need to be made. I want to thank you again for taking the time to work on an area that is so impactful, not only for yourself, but for your team, for your industry, for your company. I really appreciate you, especially in this time, holding off on your calendar. I hope that you, your family, again, your companies, your communities are all doing well and will continue to do well. But please, please, please reach out to me if you have any questions, or if you want to just sort of dive into something, or if you've got something you want to talk about, give me a call, and I'll be happy to process it a little bit with you and see what we can do. Okay, you've got all my contact information there, phone number, email, website. But what I would also say, apart from the survey and filling that out, it really helps continue to develop great content for those I serve, and really make it, serving them the best I can be. But here's some other ways to connect with me so we can share sort of nice stories, experiences, content. Follow me on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter. Definitely on LinkedIn. Go on there, connect with me. I love hearing about all the great things going on in your area, but I really do appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate you letting me share some of the things that I am passionate about. And I look forward to hearing about all your success in managing conflict. Take care. Go lead.